As you all know, our guest today is Joe Kahn, who's been the executive editor of the Times for the past 2 years, a period when the Times has thrived while newspapers around the country are cutting staff or folding outright. As the paper itself said when it announced his elevation, Joe, as managing editor, spearheaded the newsroom's reinvention for the internet age and geared it to an increasingly international audience. He expanded the use of news updates and emphasized visual and audio journalism as much as the written word. Luckily, the past 2 years have been full of news, and the Times now has 10 million digital subscribers. Joe grew up in the Boston area, where his father was co-founder of Staples, the office supply chain. He graduated Harvard, where he had been an editor of the Crimson, and received a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Harvard's Graduate School, learning Mandarin along the way. He went to China as a freelancer during the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 and was detained in order to leave the country, got hired by the Dallas Morning News to report on China from Hong Kong, and he shared a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for articles about violence against women. Snatched up by the Wall Street Journal, he eventually served in their Shanghai bureau. We've been talking about Shanghai because Eileen was born in Shanghai. After a few years there, he joined the Times to spend another 5 years in China, sharing another Pulitzer Prize in 2006 with Jim Yardley for articles about China's flawed legal system. He returned to New York as deputy foreign editor and was appointed international editor in 2011. Dean Baquet made Joe his number 2 managing editor, and in 2022, with Dean's retirement, Joe was named executive editor. He lives in Manhattan with his wife Shannon Wu, and they have 2 sons. So, Joe, I'd like to call you up. What prompted you to get into journalism?
Well, I actually never imagined myself doing anything else, to be honest. So it wasn't a choice between journalism or some other thing. I started, as I'm sure many people here did, I began, doing various forms of journalism in high school, at my student newspaper in high school, where initially I was kind of interested in the almost sort of like the engineering part of newspapers, because it seemed kind of, that was in the days when you kind of did these, you pasted up a newspaper, so there was a little bit of like graphic design in it, and a little bit of skill with an X-Acto knife, and it seemed, and I had seen some people doing it, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And they did it quickly, and they sliced everything up, and then you kind of did your trims right there on the board. And I got into that in high school. There was no one else ever doing it, so I was the one who put together the paper. And then I realized at some point that if you actually wanted to get ahead in the business, you had to not just put the articles onto a page, you had to write them too. So I started doing some of that in high school as well. And then by the time I was at Harvard, it was pretty clear from my freshman year that I was gonna, like the Crimson, which is a Harvard student newspaper, it has a sort of center of gravity and tends to draw people in. It's independent, and it is run by students, and it can very easily take over your life as an undergraduate, and it did take over mine.
Okay.
And I ended up spending a big part of my undergraduate career on it. So by the time I was finished with college, it was not a question of what I would do, it was a question of where I would do it, how I would find a way into it.
Could you explain your particular interest in China?
That was also, China was, well, I first went, when I graduated, my first job was actually in Texas. The Dallas paper, the Dallas Morning News, offered me first an internship and then a job writing on their city desk. And so I covered, I covered some general assignment issues in in Dallas, and then at some point they sent me to, they had like regional bureaus, and they sent me to this city north of Dallas called Plano. And that was my first major job. I was the Plano bureau chief of the Dallas Morning News. Nobody had heard of it, including my parents, but it was like, yeah, I had bureau chief in the name. And a big story happened when I was there, which was J.C. Penney, which had been a New York-based department store chain, made the decision to leave New York and move its headquarters to Plano, Texas, where I was the bureau chief. So I had a big story and scoop on J.C. Penney, and that was sort of my start a little bit as a business reporter. But I also realized at some point that if I played all my cards right and continued to get big stories like J.C. Penney, 5 years later, I might be able to cover the Dallas City Hall, and if that went well, the Austin Bureau loomed as sort of a State House reporter from the Texas Capitol. Not to say those were bad jobs, but I was seeing that this was going to be a slow process, and China was, in those days, this was the late 80s, China was just emerging as a place where people were visiting, business delegations were going, universities were starting up their China programs, and it looked like it was going to be a big story in the future, and there were very few people, including at the New York Times, who had any training in any language facility in Chinese. So it just looked like if I were going to make a bet to try to expedite, my career path as a foreign correspondent, that China was a good opportunity. So I went back to school and I studied East Asian Studies and Mandarin at that time, and just kind of just made a bet on China, which ended up becoming, in fact, a big part of my time as a reporter.
You had a pretty rough time the first few years because you were detained. That must have been scary.
Yeah, it was interesting. I would say I was incredibly lucky because the first time I went to China as a reporter, as you said, I was still working for the Dallas paper, but I was actually in grad school, and I went back because in the spring of 1989, with a lot of close newspaper readers here, people may remember that period. The spring of 1989, the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, made a big trip to China to visit the Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader at that time, in this big effort to have a rapprochement between Russia and China, which had had a famous Cold War split. So this was the first time since that split under Khrushchev that a Soviet leader had made a trip to China. So the Dallas paper at that time had foreign bureaus, and they had, they were a thriving regional newspaper, but they had nobody in China, and they knew that I was interested and was studying, and they said, we'll send you to Beijing, cover this trip by Mikhail Gorbachev. And I was in the middle of my final exams for my first year in my master's program, and I said yes, and I told my teachers the next day that I was going to have to skip out because I had an opportunity that I couldn't miss. And in late April, I went to Beijing to cover that. What it turned into was, because of the occasion of that trip, there were a lot of student protests at that time, and they used the opportunity of this historic state visit to flood into Tiananmen Square, which is the center of the capital, and begin demanding democracy in China. And they bet correctly that because of the sensitivity of this visit, the authorities wouldn't crack down on them at that moment because they didn't want to disrupt it. That turned into the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. So I just happened to be I got my opportunity to cover this historic state visit, but then I ended up staying long after Gorbachev left to cover the student demonstrations, and then on June 4th, 1989, famously, the crackdown that finally happened on the student protests. So that became a pretty big story for me. I stayed a couple weeks after that, even during the imposition of martial law, and eventually I was picked up going out and doing reporting around Beijing. They said this is a violation of your visa, martial law, and they booted me out. But it wasn't at that time particularly, I look at our reporters around the world now and the risks that they're taking for stories, and I cannot say that I felt that, the daily risk that a frontline reporter in Ukraine is taking, or that a photojournalist in Gaza is taking to do their job today is absolutely on another level. China was, not happy to have reporters running around at that time, but they were also, they treated me relatively with kid gloves, sort of escorting me to the airport, putting me on a plane, and then, a year later, actually, I was able to get another visa and go back in. So that was, if that's scary, I'll take scary over what scary looks like today.
Well, it's pretty scary being executive editor of the New York Times.
That's scary.
So tell me, you and I were talking before that the ethics and standards of journalism are being challenged by younger reporters who lean toward a more subjective, less neutral approach to important stories. Abe Rosenthal famously said that his legacy would be that he kept the paper straight. But some younger staffers seem to dispute his philosophy. They think objectivity is a delusion. What are your thoughts about the split among staffers, and how do you work with the newsroom that may not fully embrace the principles of objectivity and neutrality?
You're right, first of all. I got in a little bit of hot water, actually, with some parts of our staff, because I was quoted saying something similar to what you just said in this Wall Street Journal article about the Times, where I was sort of asked more generally about, the types of people coming into journalism today. And I did talk about, this generation and their motivations for getting into journalism, and the fact that I really do believe that colleges, university environments, and unfortunately even journalism schools are not doing a very good job of preparing people for what we consider to be our journalistic mission, which is, as we've said very clearly, and A.P. Sulzberger has been a leader in this, which is independent journalism, meaning essentially that we ask people not necessarily to forget their own personal identity or their personal values. Those are indelible part of everybody as an individual. But when you come and work at the New York Times, and I think at any good news organization, you have to be willing also to embrace, or primarily to embrace, a journalistic value, which often forces you to explore other points of view, which are not your own, and to follow facts, even if they lead you in a direction which doesn't fully comport with your own priors, with your own incoming assumptions or beliefs, and to create journalism, to write journalism that reflects the true story, or as close as we can get to the truth, often without regard to what your own personal desire would be. And I'm talking to a group of veteran journalists, you all know that. When I talk to a group of younger people about this, it begins an argument. And the argument isn't easy to win with that generation of people. So we have had to be much more selective in terms of who we hire. We have put into place, much more rigorous kind of interview panels, and we've had to invest heavily in building the culture that we want rather than assuming that there will just be shared values among our staff and that we can refer in shorthand to the way we do it, because there is no shorthand. We have to, that culture is not being reinforced either by universities, where I think people are, in my view, less open to vigorous debate from rival sides on the key and divisive issues of the time than I recall from university years. But I also think journalism schools are not teaching people the way they should. It should be in my view, it should be a requirement in journalism schools, and I've actually heard some journalism professors talk about this, to give people assignments to write about or report on an issue which is directly contrary to their own stated preference or values. Go out there and write. I want you, young journalism student at Columbia Journalism School, to go out and write an empathetic article on someone who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 but is preparing to vote for Donald Trump in 2024. And I want to see what that article looks like. And if you do a compelling article that shows that you can get to know this person, talk to this person, bring them alive in the report, give me a well-rounded version of why this person has changed their mind about Joe Biden and decided to be open to Donald Trump in 2024, that, to me, is going to be a qualification for getting a job. I don't care whether you like Joe Biden or Donald Trump. That's irrelevant to me. In fact, if you like Joe Biden and you write that empathetic article about the person who's changed their mind, that's a stronger qualification. But if you actually tried to assign that at Columbia Journalism School, I think people would say, I'm not taking that assignment. That's the struggle that we have right now. So we have had, to invest in our own newsroom effort at, first of all, recruiting young people who are more open-minded, and then investing in the effort to create the culture and the incentive system for people to do that kind of journalism, because it's not being done for us by anybody else.
When you do articles about Joe Biden and Donald Trump, of the kind that you suggested, where you send out reporters and you want them to talk how a Donald Trump supporter thinks, you also get pushback from liberal. You have gotten pushback from liberal,
from our own readers
who say that you're being too kind to Donald Trump. How do you handle that? And vice versa, that you're being too hard on Joe Biden because of his age.
The other day, this past weekend, we've had several. We have a polling operation, and it's we have a very good polling operation. In fact, the New York Times Siena College polls are the best polls in the country. They're expensive. They put a lot of time and money into it and statistical modeling, and they've just got very good people working on it. They were the best polls in 2020, they have best polls in 2022, and they will be the best polls, I believe, in this election cycle as well. So we're very closely watched for our polls. And we had a series of polls, both national and battleground state, that, as you all know, showed Donald Trump, ahead, both nationally and battleground states, by a significant margin, until the most recent poll that appeared just this past Saturday, we published it, which showed Joe Biden narrowing the gap to within 1 percentage point nationally among registered voters with Donald Trump. Which is within the margin of error. So it means the race is effectively tied. So my inbox was flooded, actually, by people who were, first of all, praising the New York Times for finally having a pro-Biden poll. You finally had a pro-Biden poll. So you've gotten the message. You need to stop with this pro-Trump polling, right? These are our readers. These are our loving subscribers, right? Thank you for stop. And it's like, do you not understand what a poll is? A poll is, you don't decide that a poll is going to be a pro-Biden poll or a pro-Trump poll. You poll people and reflect the result. That's why we'll watch for our polls, right? To a certain extent, that is, there is a class of readers who is exactly like that. It's like either you are on this side or you're against this side. There isn't necessarily a giant constituency out there, at least that professes to want an independent news source. So the same problem we're having with our staff, we're having with our readers. You might say at some point, like, why don't you just throw in the towel and become the Intercept or something, but we're not going to do that because despite the fact that some members of our staff and some part of our subscribers don't act as though they want a authoritative independent news source, they actually do. They still, that's why we have 10 million, right? And it's still growing. Because people, what they say they want is not necessarily what they end up respecting or needing to turn to in those big moments. And when we invest in that independent journalism, even though the headwinds sometimes suggest we'd be easier off just giving it up, we actually enhance our authority, we enhance our credibility, we make ourselves more authoritative, and we become the resource that people turn to in the most divisive moments because they need an independent news source. They may not want it, but they need it. And I think people actually know that they need it because on the big election days, we have a very, very large surge in readership from red states. Those are not people who are naturally inclined in sort of a belief system or a faith system to identify with the New York Times, but they come to us in those moments on election day because they, like anybody else, want authoritative and accurate election news and results. And so our investment in being that kind of a resource in a nonpartisan way will ultimately pay off, even though if you poll people, they may not say that they won't.
So the Times has had some very strong personalities as executive editor. Quite distinctive figures like Abe Rosenthal, Max Franco, Howell Raines, Jill Abramson, Dean Baquet, Joe Lillyville. Dean was an outgoing fellow, while your style is said to be more reserved. The fact the Washington Post described you as circumspect. I had to look that up. What would you say about how your management style contrasts with these figures?
Am I less outgoing than Jill Abramson, I guess would be the... maybe, Dean actually, Dean was, my mentor as well as my boss, and we worked together for most of the time that he was executive editor. And I learned a lot from him, and I'm a very different, it's true. I mean, my personality is different, my interests are different, my journalistic experience was very different from his. He was he spent most of his career as an investigative reporter, an editor, and I spent most of mine as a foreign correspondent. What I admired about him was the way that he, first of all, his enthusiasm for the best and biggest journalism that we're doing is something that, any executive editor of the New York Times has to admire and follow as a model. The biggest stories, especially the ones where you're kind of running into the most resistance, and the reporters and the editors involved in that need to know that they have the backing of the newsroom's leadership. Not just the backing, but the support and the interest and, almost the granular sort of cheering on the next, almost to the next time you get off the phone with an advance. It's that level. So, and then similarly, you know, when we've got all these people engaged in all this incoming on Israel and Gaza, and the reporters are out there taking fire for what they're doing, and their presumed bias, and they're being attacked on social media. The role of the editor, and I did again learn this from Dean, is you just have to be there with them. You know, they have to know that you're reading everything that they do, supporting what they do, working through these stories together with them, supporting them when they do something big and controversial, and defending them when they're under attack. And you know, I have the word executive in my title, but the emphasis is on editor, right? It's like you're the top editor. We have a lot of editors, but you're the editor. And you know, what I saw from Dean and what I've tried to emulate when I can is just, you really just need to be on the side of the people doing the toughest work and the toughest moments. You know, and I made a joke about Jill. I actually enjoyed working with Jill as well, and Jill wasn't the most extroverted person, but she did, she just had like an unerring instinct for the story that the rest of the media was somehow missing. I just really admired that from her. She could see the way like the group was going, like our people were going, and the Journal and the Post, and they were all going like this, and she's like, they're wrong, you know, they got it wrong. You know, and when she said that, she was usually right, that she got, you know, and like, you needed to look at it from a different angle. And she had that instinct on so many, politics was her big thing, but she had that instinct on financial stories, she had that instinct on international stories, and just, you know, the role of, in her view, the role of the editor was to question conventional wisdom wherever it was. You know, whatever the conventional wisdom is, I'm already bored by it. It has to be something, we have to be doing something else. And I learned that quite a bit from Jill. And then from Bill Keller, who, you know, I also worked with both as a reporter and in the early days as an editor. You know, there was no bigger champion in New York, maybe Joe Larigold too, you know, of just the classic role of a foreign correspondent, you know, who could, in a single article, capture the news, the moment, the culture, the history. Every phrase in what he wrote was nicely crafted, and he kept looking for that and pressing for it. And just that, you know, that fine eye and writer's touch that lifted, you know, what could be ordinary newspaper journalism into something really worth reading and remembering, you know, something that captured a moment for the history books, you know, was always something that I looked to Bill for. And I could keep going, but basically there isn't an executive editor of the New York Times that I didn't learn something from. And you know, I hope someday that future executive editors will learn something from me, but I'm not yet sure what it will be.
I want to open up to questions from the audience, but I have one last question involving AI. How is AI going? Well, first of all, you recently hired Zach Seward, a former Wall Street Journal reporter and founding editor at Quartz, to experiment with AI tools and design training for journalists. What's the goal and reasoning there, and how do you predict AI will change our jobs and the newspaper?
Zach is a great hire for us, and very much a journalist, but also, as you said, even well before the last year or so when AI, you couldn't have a single discussion about anything journalistic without some discussion of AI. Zach was invested in it already and thinking carefully about it, including some interesting experiments at Quartz, which was an innovative digital, still is, an innovative digital news organization that tried some things in terms of the way they interacted with readers using artificial intelligence, and he's leading an interesting exploration at the Times now of the ways in which we could begin to use certain AI tools to enhance what we're doing. And what I'd say is that Zach's job is not to pontificate about AI, but to look at everything that we do with an open mind and say, is there a way that these tools could help us do it better? We're not standing, on the outside. Dean actually recently compared the early days of AI and the media's reaction to it with the early days of the internet and the media's reaction to it, and we don't want to kind of like miss that bus again, right? Like, whatever this tool offers to us in any way that we should be using it and accepting it as a phenomenon that we have to understand and apply in our intelligent journalistic way, keeping our mission in mind. We should be investing in that and embracing it. Even as we continue to report on and explore, the more apocalyptic, kind of worries about the way AI could replace human beings. So I think we have to do both things at the same time.
Speaking of apocalyptic, is it going to replace reporters and editors?
Not at the Times in the time that I'm there. Like that I can say fairly assuredly, because if it does, then I will be out of a job, and if I have any agency in it, I will continue to insist on the value of human reporting, because I think the value is irreplaceable. And honestly, it's hard for me to imagine. It isn't hard for me to imagine that some of the things that people and newsroom staffs do today could either be simplified, enhanced, sped up, made more efficient by AI. But the core work that journalists and editors do seems to me to require human beings. And I don't really see why a leading news organization would even be interested in replacing, because fundamentally the work is human. In fact, what we're doing today, even before AI takes over the way people consume news on the internet, is we're leaning even more into the identity and the expertise of the individual journalists who are reporting and telling the stories. So if you look at the New York Times today, I hope you're finding and learning much more about the people behind those stories than you would have 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We do a lot more reporter on camera video. The reporter's expertise is called out in what we call enhanced bylines. We allow not personal views, but reporters to reflect on the experience that they had in reporting or getting information for a story, or the obstacles that they have. We want to be more transparent, and we want our report to be less, like something that comes from a skyscraper on 8th Avenue, and something that comes from human beings who are out there interacting with people, having experiences, having conversations. We want their identity to be front and center, as long as it is, of course, that journalistic identity to be front and center. But we want that to be a bigger part of the report. So the idea that we're looking for some sort of tool to replace the human interface and make our journalism come out anonymously from a chatbot is exactly the opposite of what we want to do as a news organization. And it's the opposite of what we wanted to do as a news organization, in part because people are able to get information out of a chatbot, right? If you can have a chatbot spit out an answer to any question you have, why would you want the same function from the New York Times? What value would the New York Times have? We don't have as much resources as Microsoft or Google has. And if it's only about perfecting a chatbot, then we don't necessarily have any value. But also, I know that the value for the New York Times is in the expertise. I think everybody in this room knows the value is in the talent that we have. It's in the expertise, the accumulated wisdom, and the human element, even the human frailty of being a journalist and experiencing the things that are going on in the world and then telling people about those. It's not in the machine-like element of just informing them.
Thank you very much, Joe. I really appreciate the candor, and so I'm going to open it up to
Joe, how do you decide which articles in the next day's paper you're going to read, and what percentage of the controversies that arise out of a particular day's paper involve stories that you haven't read?
Yeah. Good question. I'd like to say that they all the controversies involve the stories that I haven't read, but it wouldn't be true. The truth is, though, that, you know, obviously we publish a lot of stories every day, and I can't come close to reading all of them beforehand, or, you know, even all of them afterward. And, you know, being editor of the Times today does require probably more than it did when essentially everything that we publish could be contained in a single day's newspaper. You know, and, you know, you have to have a lot of confidence in the people that you pick to lead different areas of coverage. And, you know, to hold them to account you know, for reading on your behalf. Typically, my reading habit consists of a couple things. One, you know, I do run the daily news meeting every morning, early every morning. You know, so I get up early and sort of read deeply in what we're reporting on overnight and in the early morning, and what our big bets are for the day. And as a result of that, you know, I end up running the news meeting and calling on people who, you know, to discuss different things that they're excited about or worried about, or areas of coverage that are emerging. And so I get a lot of incoming in the morning. You know, people saying, we're doing this, you should take a look at this, we're excited about this. And I do a lot of my reading between the hours of sort of 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. essentially, when we're kind of setting the agenda for the day. And that includes, you know, big enterprise that might be ready for publication in that cycle, or you know, early indications of a piece of analysis that we're doing on a story that you know, that someone wants to build out during the day. So a bunch of reading is caught up with that. And then at the tail end, I get sent stuff, you know, that you know, more ambitious pieces of enterprise that are there are two kinds, basically. There's the thing like people think it's 100% done and it's the best thing they've ever done, and they want you to know it, and they want you to send them a note back saying this is great, right? So I get to read those. And then the second one is this is potentially toxic, and we think we've got it, but you better read it because you're going to take responsibility, not me. That category I get to. So those are the two that kind of get sent. And then of course I have trolling rights, so I can troll around in our system. Anything that I'm interested in, I can ask to see. But a lot of the stuff is in those two categories.
Thank you. Hi, Joe. Thank you for being here. I'm a Times alumna, and I have a vested interest in the paper. And I have to ask you this: why is the Times not covering a huge story that's transforming New York City? And I'm talking about the e-bikes. They're every place. They're on the sidewalks, in the parks, in the streets. They're reckless. They go at high speed. There's no control. There's no regulation. There's no registration. There's no insurance. As you probably know, a lot of people have been seriously injured by these bikes. And I don't understand why, when we have a transformative situation in the city, the Times is not covering it.
I think, you know, I think we have covered a little bit. We should do more. I have some good news in that we've had discussions about that, because I think e-bikes are part of a bigger story. And actually, Joe and I were discussing this earlier, but the streets of New York just feel like they're in a kind of chaotic transition. And I think it's a fascinating story. And I just think we need to be covering all aspects of it. I mean, you know, does New York want to have cars? How many cars does it want to, how much should they pay to be able to drive in Midtown? That's a big issue. this trend of turning, major streets like Broadway into pedestrian zones, the trend that happened during the pandemic of allowing restaurants to expand out into parking areas and what happens to those and how those get permitted. E-bikes are part of it, bikes that are not electric powered are part of it, scooters are out there as well. What are the rules around those things? And I just think the streets are up for grabs at the moment. There's interesting politics around it, there's interesting police issues around it, there's constituencies that are forming around these and including mass transportation and the subway and where the resources go. And so we have just put a reporter full-time on this question of the battle for the streets of New York, and we're starting a newsletter on that subject. And I hope you will be a subscriber to that newsletter. And I actually think, if I were a Metro reporter today, that would be the story I want to cover. Because I actually think the daily life of the most important city in the country is in fact defined by who's winning on the streets. And it's just like what was the book from the 30s, the Pushcart Wars, kind of had an element of that in New York. Like New York is again being reinvented by who wins the battle of its streets. And I get which side you're on that. But I think I agree with you, it's a fascinating game.
Over here, Joe.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Nancy.
Hi, Joe. Two-part question. One is about the upcoming elections. Can you give us some idea of some things that might be different than how elections have been covered in the past that you may have planned? And then my second one is China, which is, okay, we've got Keith Bradshaw in China, but there's so much of our China coverage that has to be done from afar. So talk to us a little bit about how we're covering China, which, especially right now when there's so much tension between the two, and getting access.
Okay, in terms of elections, I'm trying to think what we would be doing this year that would be really fundamentally new from what you've seen in the past. I do think you're going to see more efforts that we have underway to repackage our best election coverage in a way that will travel better on the internet. So we have a big effort on making election coverage more accessible. I think if you are a New York Times reader and you're coming to us directly on the website or in print, you're going to see an array of coverage, which obviously we have some pretty big issues around these two candidates, and each of them presents separate challenges, but you'll find an array of coverage which shouldn't feel completely unfamiliar to at least the last couple of election cycles. But where I do think we're investing a lot more is creating these shorter form vertical video versions of our coverage that we hope can reach a lot more people who are not coming to us directly, because they're also not going to Google and searching for election information. They're receiving information in vertical video form on Instagram and TikTok. And we have 10 million subscribers, and a lot more than that who come to us occasionally. But there are tens or hundreds of millions of people who are not navigating to major websites to get their news. They're getting it passively in their feed, usually in vertical video form. And unless we're investing in trying to repackage our coverage and help make it available to them, they're not going to see it. So I don't know whether you're on TikTok or Instagram, but one thing that would be different in the 2024 election compared to 2020 is I expect we're going to be there with what I hope will be compelling versions of New York Times political reporting to keep people informed ahead of the election. In terms of China, when I left China, which was 2008 as a correspondent, which also happened to coincide with the Olympics. Beijing hosted the Olympics. In some way, that was really the peak of foreign correspondence in China in terms of number. We around that time, you know, we had, I think the peak was 10 correspondents in China, but we also invested at that time in a Chinese language journalism website that had another, at its peak, it had 30 people working for it, translators and people doing original journalism in Chinese to serve a Chinese audience. And almost all of that is gone. And the reason is that the Chinese, first of all, they closed their internet space to foreign publishers. So we were banned as a website. The Chinese website we had was also banned. But during the Trump administration, there was also a tit-for-tat expulsion of journalists. So the Trump State Department and National Security team withdrew journalist accreditations for almost 200 state media reporters, Chinese state media reporters who were working in the United States. And China, in retaliation, withdrew a similar percentage of visas for American correspondents in China. Obviously, state media reporters and reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, we don't think they're the same thing, but the Chinese didn't care about that. So a bunch of our people had to leave. And we struggled for years. We were down, you're absolutely right, we were down to one correspondent in China, Keith Bradsher, who stuck it out. We recently got one more visa, so we have a second reporter in China. We would like to go back to having, you know, many more than that, but at the moment, there's no opportunity to it. So we have 5 people in Taiwan, we have a big office in Seoul, we have people in Hong Kong. It's a little bit back to the future. The people on the periphery of mainland China have as part of their responsibility coverage of what's happening in the mainland. It's back to Cultural Revolution, like when we were not allowed to have people there. So it's a big challenge. We're still determined to get good coverage of China in our report and to cover all aspects of it, including some of the incredible technology advances that they're making in electric vehicles and renewable energy, but also to cover what's become a much more authoritarian leadership and less permissive environment for certainly for political dissent, but also for entrepreneurs, you know, private sector, people existing outside the state system. So it remains a very important story, but we're really constrained with the resources that we have to cover it.
Hi, Joe. It's Donald McNeil. There have been a lot of controversies at the Times recently involving some members of the Times trashing each other publicly or privately and then publicly. And I'm very grateful that you said a year ago that the Times will not tolerate any more of this. It doesn't welcome it and will not tolerate it. I found it disturbing that the Guild seems to take the attitude that there's a right to trash other employees, other Times members, and seems to be fighting for that. And I wondered, which I think is a bad thing as a longtime union organizer. I think union members should not trash each other any more than Times employees let to trash each other. And I wondered, have you considered approaching Susan DeCarava, the head of the New York Guild, or John Schlois, the head of the National Guild, privately and saying, hey, we have a common cause here, not to see our members of our respective organizations trashing each other. Have you ever thought about doing something like that? Not at the negotiating table, because that's always disastrous, but I mean, privately, in a way that you could both see that there's value for your members in these, in that kind of an arrangement.
It's a good thought. I haven't done it. I've never met Susan Carva. I do talk with senior members in the New York Times newsroom, as you know, who are leaders, the New York Times unit in the News Guild, but I think it's worth thinking about how we approach, the Guild leadership as a whole, and whether there's a way that we can, understanding that we represent, we're or represent opposing sides at the bargaining table, we nonetheless should share a common interest in protecting our staff and their members from these kinds of attacks. I completely agree with it. I don't understand, honestly, well, I understand, but I certainly think it's a bad trend that the Guild leadership has chosen to embrace, kind of activist stances on leading coverage issues in the news in the moment as part of their effort to mobilize their staff, because they represent news staff, and news staff, by craft, by profession, by discipline, have to cover different sides of those issues, and to actually take an activist stand on that seems to me to be completely out of sync with the interests of the members. And I've noted some members of the New York Times News Guild unit have started, what they call an independence caucus within the Guild to sort of remind leadership of that. That's a decision they're making on their own. It's not done in any kind of coordination with management. So I think, in some ways, I've just been debating, is the best thing to stand back and let Guild members work this out on their own? Is it try to step in and have a direct relationship with Guild leadership? I don't know. I appreciate your thought and suggestion. Maybe we should talk offline about it sometime. But I'm struggling with the same thing.
Hi. In 2015, the Times, maybe under now managing editor Carolyn Ryan, or you, I don't know who, embarked on a joint investigation of the Clinton Foundation with Steve Bannon's associate Peter Schweitzer. Now, I'm not suggesting the Clinton Foundation wasn't worthy of investigation, but I do reflect on Steve Bannon's brag that he had managed to infect the mainstream media, which is important because the New York Times to this day still sets the agenda for the national media. My question is what you think of that in retrospect, and whether there are any collaborative efforts driven by either party to have the Times investigate somebody during this election cycle that the newspaper is not doing on its own.
Well, let me focus on the second part of your question, because the first part is, I think it's a little bit more complicated than the way you're, but I get the broad gist of it. Look, I don't think that we should be doing, partnerships with political organizations on investigative coverage of politics. I mean, and generally speaking, I just don't think that makes sense. We do partnerships all the time, but I don't think we should be partnering with people that have a political agenda. And we do put time and effort. We have partners a lot, but we have a high standard for who those partners are and what they bring to the table, what their expertise is, and what we're gaining from that partnership. And I would not want, to be partnering with any kind of an organization that had a political agenda, or that was in it for, a narrow financial reason, or that was benefiting in that way. So yes, scrutiny of partnerships is important, and we're committed to doing that, even though we do have a variety of partnerships around the country for different kinds of reporting.
I joined the New York Times 72 years ago this month. There's been a lot of ups and downs for the paper and the country. We never thought during that period that American democracy is really threatened. The fact is, it is now, and it's your responsibility as the head of the paper of record and the outstanding exponent of American journalism. How do you approach that responsibility?
I want to make sure that not only every reader of the New York Times, but every curious voter in the country has the information they need, to understand the stakes in this election, and the stakes clearly involve the issue that you just described, which is that one of the candidates in this election has very openly espoused a desire to take steps that would undermine some of the institutions of our democracy, including, control of the Justice Department and the court system, including, the undoing of civil service protections in order to be able to enhance the authority of the executive, including, the expulsion of immigrants who have been given legal permission to stay in the country but haven't become citizens. I mean, there are a variety and we've been very frank in reporting on those. Some of the work that I'm proudest of from this past year has been done by a team including Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan, and Charlie Savage, who have gotten inside access to some of the people in Trump's camp who are putting together his agenda for 2025 and writing about it, exposing it and writing about it and putting it out there for people to see. And we're going to be doing another version of that this year to revisit all of those themes, and as I was saying earlier, to make sure that not just New York Times readers, but anybody interested in the stakes of this election have access to that information, can understand it plainly, and can have that in mind when they make the decision on the election. We can't control the election result. We can do everything in our power to make sure that the largest number of people possible are armed with the information they need to make those decisions, even though we know we can't make them for them. And the New York Times, even in this election, is not a partisan, but we are going to look, we're not going to have blinders on when we look at the potential impact of a second Trump presidency. And people will know what the potential impact can be before November 5th.
One more question.
The last word here. Moving out from the e-bike issue, which really touched a chord, thank you. I'm wondering why in the world the metropolitan coverage is such a wasteland. Where's the fearless reporting? There's so many big issues in New York City. Why is it puff pieces?
So I know that I now know that the Silurians are print readers, right? Yes, the Metropolitan is the sort of Sunday Metro edition, which evolved over years to be, a little bit of a more feature-oriented Sunday read. The core coverage of the city of New York, of which we have a lot and a huge investment, and I feel strongly about, is integrated into what we call our A-book, basically the front section, and isn't, as this earlier question was, we don't have a freestanding in print, a freestanding Metro section anymore. We certainly have enough New York reporting for a freestanding Metro section, but I have to be honest that the amount of work that goes into the print edition over time we've had to try to reduce. That we have 10 now, it's about 10.5 million digital subscribers. The number of print subscribers continues to go down, and I hope it goes down slowly, but it is going down, and it has been going down for a long time, and it's a pretty inevitable course. And the amount of special work that we do to produce things which are mainly or exclusively for print has had to go down over time so that we can reprogram reporters, editors, producers, so that we can invest in multimedia journalism and graphical journalism to tell stories in a more immersive way for a much larger audience of people who are not print readers. So I am not spending much of my time, honestly, on print. I care about it. I want the existing print subscribers to continue to be subscribers as long as they prefer getting their news that way. And we have a very talented group of people whose job is defined exclusively by putting out a print edition every day. And they care about it deeply, and there are good designers on it, good editors on it, They have to write all the headlines. They're still producing a robust multi-section print edition every day, and they will be for years. But my job has to be to produce the best multimedia digital report for the largest possible audience that I can. So I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about, you know, the mix of Metro stories that appear on Sunday versus the ones that are integrating into the A-book during the week. Everything that you see in the Metropolitan section, everything that you see in the print edition, it, you know, has already appeared digitally, and often not in the same cycle. So print is being prepared downstream of the digital, of the print edition for almost anything. There's almost nothing today that's closing exclusively on print deadlines. It's all closing before. Some of it is published days before. You know, even the Sunday magazine of the New York Times is often published, you know, sometimes 10 days before it appears in the print magazine. If you prefer to get it in print, it's still beautifully laid out. It's still there to appreciate in print. But my focus is on how to create the most robust digital report with that same material whenever it appears, not with respect to when it's going to appear in print.
I just want to say I really appreciate you know, your candor and thoughtfulness.
Can't hear you.
It's the first time people have told me you can't hear me. Usually I'm too loud. I just wanted to say that I appreciate how candid and thoughtful you've been in explaining how complicated the job of an editor, executive editor is. So I think you all deserve you deserve it.
I'm gonna